In the foreword to the Field Guide to the Poetry of Theodore Roethke, Edward Hirsch writes, Theodore Roethke moved among the mysteries. He celebrated and moralized the American landscape, schooled his spirit in the greenhouse and the marshland, and transformed himself into a major romantic poet. His work, which began in Michigan, ended up embracing all North America. He was a mid-century American poet, a key figure in the so-called middle generation, who worked himself free of the straitjacket of American poetry in the 40s and 50s. He worked against the grain. It is a marvel how he managed to inherit and extend the romantic tradition of William Butler Yeats, Wallace Stevens, and Hart Crane, and belongs to that visionary company. Before his death, Sam Hamill said that the poetry of the Cascadia bioregion began with the North American sequence by Theodore Roethke from his posthumous book, The Far Field. Bill Barillas is the editor of A Field Guide to the Poetry of Theodore Roethke, author of The Midwestern Pastoral, Place and Landscape in Literature of the American Heartland, and serves on the board of the Friends of Roethke Foundation. He joins us now via Zoom. Bill, what a pleasure to talk to you today.
Pleasure to speak with you, Paul. Uh, I want to pronounce my name for the viewers out there. Barillas. Silent,
Barillas.
Barillas, sí, silent
Sí,
L's.
lo siento, hermano.
No, no, está bien. Barillas.
Barillas. Well,
Uh,
good.
my mother was Irish American, married to my father, who was Guatemalan American, would tell people it's Barillas like tortillas.
Sí, no jodas. Lo siento. Mi madre es una cubana,
Ah,
pero
qué bien.
mi español es mierda. Lo siento. I'll just apologize for that. Well, good. Señor Barillas, the first question I have is, tell us how you first became aware of the work of Theodore Roethke.
Okay. Well, I'm from Michigan, Roethke's home state, and actually, I grew up in the same river valley. Roethke grew up on the in Saginaw, Michigan, which is on the Tittabawassee River, which is a tributary of the Saginaw. I grew up near Flint, Michigan, um, right by the Flint River, also a tributary of the Saginaw. So we come from the same watershed. Um, so when I was in college and I was a graduate student, that was when I got into his work as a undergraduate. I was at the University of Michigan. Curriculum was entirely English literature. So I explored poetry, American poetry on my own. I was writing poetry and I was writing poetry about the landscape that I knew about Michigan, and I was starting to get interested in Michigan history. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I was doing cultural studies. And some other student showed me a couple of Recky's poems. If I remember correctly, the first poem I encountered was The Waking. And from there, I started looking at his work. Um, Immediately connected with it because since high school, I fell in love with the English and American romantic poets, and Roethke being square in that tradition. As Jay Perini, who's a contributor to my book on Roethke, titled his book on Theodore Roethke, he titled it Theodore Roethke, American Romantic. And that was the attraction, the mysticism, the love of nature, the connection to Emerson and Thoreau, as well as to the British Romantics, especially Blake. Um, and when I got to grad school, which was at Michigan State, one of the first stories I heard there was about Roethke's ill-fated um, partial semester teaching there in the 30s when he had his first manic episode requiring hospitalization. That story was, and probably, for all I know, still is a legend among grad students. It's told about in the biography of Roethke by Alan Seeger, The Glass House. It was a pivotal moment in his life. But I I started getting seriously into his work, and I wrote a um, as a master's, my second year of my master's program in creative writing. I took a graduate seminar in American Studies with the professor who would become my dissertation director, James I. McClintock, who was doing work on American responses to the natural environment. And that was the topic of the seminar. And my seminar paper, was a long essay on Michigan poets of place. So I wrote about especially Roethke at the head, and then Jim Harrison, Judith Minty, Dan Gerber. Um, Another professor, uh, David D. Anderson, who was the founder of the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature, whom I'd been urged to talk to, um, told me that I needed to present that at the annual conference of SSML, which is in East Lansing in May every year. And so I did present that essay, um, and um, I won the essay award at the first conference I'd been to, which is really pretty nice. Um, and that be, that that essay became the basis of my dissertation, and which was on Michigan. Well, it was on Midwestern writers of place, including a chapter on the Michigan poets. That in time became my first book, The Midwestern Pastoral, with a chapter on Roethke. So it just evolved. And in recent years, I retired early as a professor from a school in the University of Wisconsin system. And since then, I'm started back again in my creative writing, but my scholarly focus has kind of narrowed to Roethke. Um, I've become kind of the go-to scholar when people, have a question about Roethke. I'm working on an essay on Roethke for someone else's collection right now. And I edited the first book on Roethke of the 21st century. The last book of any kind was in the 1990s. My book, A Field Guide to the Poetry of Theodore Roethke, started, hopefully, has started, uh, Roethke studies again. Um, all the books on his work came out mainly in the 70s and the 80s. There were a lot of books, and then at some point, none. But so that's my Roethke story, except for the fact that more recently I was invited to join the board of the Friends of Theodore Roethke Foundation, who preserve the poet's childhood home in Saginaw, Michigan, along with that of his uncle next door. The famous greenhouses were once behind the houses. They're no longer there. It's a suburb. But the Roethke Foundation does programming on site, as well as virtual talks and readings.
That was my next question. Tell us about the Roethke Foundation. So maybe you can expand on that quick answer.
Sure. The Roethke Foundation was founded in Saginaw. Um, uh, I can't tell you exactly how many years ago, but the founder is Anne Ransford, who's still on the board. She is the person who is responsible for saving Roethke's house. Only Roethke's had lived in that house. After Roethke's parents passed, his mother died, I believe, in the 1950s. His sister June, who was a English teacher, junior high English teacher in Saginaw, lived in the house until she passed, and that was in the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken. And that was when Anne Ransford um, got to work, created the foundation, saved the house, and the foundation ended up buying the uncle's house next door. Um, but it's uh, since I've joined the board, I got the Roethke Foundation connected with the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature. There are Roethke panels at the conference in May in East Lansing. Um, so there's interplay between the two. And more recently, uh, the the foundation has started a annual publication called Open House, which is, of course, named after Roethke's first book of poetry, Open House. Um, it's uh, a magazine about the foundation's activities. There are articles about Roethke, um, about um, things the foundation does. Um, this was the first issue, came out last year. The second issue, volume two, is currently in press.
How do we get copies?
Um, you join the Friends of Theodore Roethke Foundation, which we could put into the screen, I think. Um, or you could just Google Friends of Theodore Roethke Foundation, Saginaw, um, and members receive a copy.
It's fantastic.
Yes.
Would you like me to, oh, where are the friends? Oh, here we go. Oh, here, I'll share your screen, and this is what you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah. It's friends of Roethke.org.
there we go.
Yeah.
So you can see this, the mission, the vision, and then
Membership is up on top too.
or
Yeah.
here right there, yeah, at the bottom. Yeah, very good. So we click on membership, and there we have. So
And if you click on events, that's where you can see the upcoming events, the poetry readings, the before too long, the scholarly talks in May will be up.
fantastic. So as I'm hearing you talk about this, and I'm reading about it and getting a thought, um, the home of Lorene Niedeker, not too far from the location we're talking about, Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. So you got to go around the lake or take a ferry across the lake, I think. Um, they have bits of her poems on the buildings in downtown Fort Atkinson as murals. And um, I, I don't think it's the Friends of Lorene Niedeker, but it's some similar organization that's sprung up. And in a way, Lorene um, has become kind of a cottage industry for Fort Atkinson, which is such a beautiful development. A lot of these small towns, especially in the Midwest, the quote unquote Rust Belt, have really suffered in the age of NAFTA or the age of neoliberalism, or, you can chart the demise to probably, I'm going to say right around 1980, not to mention any names. So there's hope for me to see that these towns are thinking this is one way to get people to come to our town is to honor one of our best known literary citizens, which I think is a beautiful thing.
Oh yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's true of other towns. I do know of journals and books which have traced some of these places. Um, you know, Winesburg, not Winesburg, but in Ohio, Sherwin Anderson's hometown uh, is another. In Saginaw, Michigan, the local museum, the Hoyt Museum, has a quite a nice display on Roethke. The local university, Saginaw Valley State University, has a collection Roethke collection. Um, there's more to come in Saginaw. I think the city is coming to recognize the asset that they have in being the home of one of the great American poets. And whenever Roethke is mentioned or discussed, Saginaw comes up. So it's a great boon to a town.
Let me talk to you a little bit about bioregionalism. In the effort to set up this interview, you said you had a little knowledge of bioregionalism. I think Kirkpatrick Sale came up. And then, here you are as a young scholar really diving into the poets of place. So to me, that's exactly what bioregionalism is. Dogen in the 1200s in Japan said, when you find the place where you are, practice begins, actualizing the fundamental point. And for me, this is a way of life. For me, the main reason that we're suffering so much in our culture, and it started way before the current administration, is the fact that we are separated from our very environment. And the bioregionalists believed that we live in these places like invaders. When we
Hmm.
spoil it, take all the resources, we're like, you know what? I can move to Mount Vernon, Washington, or Wenatchee, or whatever, and then spoil that place and move on, presumably. So, talk to us about what thoughts you've had before this interview about the notion of bioregionalism.
Um, the term bioregionalism first came to me via Gary Snyder. Even in high school, I had come upon Gary Snyder's poetry. First, his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Turtle Island, which has prose as well as poetry, um, expounding on his ideas of bioregionalism and uh, living a life in place. Snyder, that was Northern California, what he called Shasta Nation. But his ideas about re-inhabitation, which is a term that bioregionalists use, um, spoke to me because I was interested in the place that I came from, Michigan, um, and so a lot of those ideas, first through Snyder, a little later I discovered the Kirkpatrick Sale's book, Dwellers in the Land, which came out in the mid 1980s. They informed what I did with Midwestern writers, starting with Roethke and other poets from Michigan. And then I started working on, the writers that I covered in other chapters of my dissertation, and then my book, Willa Cather in Nebraska, um, a student of a student of Roethke's, James Wright of Ohio, um, and then Jim Harrison, a great writer from Michigan, who was a novelist, essayist, and above all else, a poet that I was fortunate enough to get to know um, in the 1990s and the 2000s, um, who very much absorbed the thought of those past writers. He was very enamored of Gary Snyder. And in fact, the two of them did poetry readings together. Um, so that kind of thought, the thought of rediscovery, re-inhabitation of a place, I felt what that represented what I was trying to do in showing how these writers responded to their places, the natural and the human history, and then the contrast that they all drew between an ideal uh, connection to landscape and to natural history with what has actually happened in history. The theft of the land from Native Americans, um, the violence against people, the violence against nature itself, and the desire to live in a way closer to the land and more with greater responsibility.
Greater commitment. Yeah. Something you said reminded me that Johann Kiger said, it is a political act to know the history of your place.
Right. And from that came my interest in cultural studies, which is, my focus has always been literature, but literature in context, literature in historical context, ecological context, and also symbolic context. I was always interested in how mythology works, how ideas about place, for good or ill, have shaped people's responses to the places where they live. In the Midwest, where I'm from, a key myth is the pastoral myth, the idea that the Midwest is the heartland or a uh, a middlescape, a the agricultural image of the Midwest um, shapes the outlook of the people as well as the way the region is seen, understood and misunderstood. Repke, in that regard, and was interesting to me because he his father was not a farmer. His father was a florist, and so it's his father grew things, but he grew things mostly indoors in glass. And in winter, in the cold weather of Michigan with the snow and the ice, that meant heating those greenhouses. So the themes of technology come into play. They're unavoidable anyway. There's a famous book in American Studies, Leo Marx's The Machine in the Garden. The subtitle's Technology and the Pastoral Ideal in America, which was a book that was a touchstone for me in developing my dissertation and my first book. Roethke posed an interesting play on that idea of the machine in the garden, technology and the mythology of people and nature. Roethke's greenhouse posed a garden in a machine. The challenge has always been, how to retain a relationship with nature when technology is constantly growing, constantly becoming more complicated, more dominant. And that was a theme of the Romantics, in Thoreau's Walden, the image of the railroad, which went very close to Thoreau's cabin near Concord, Massachusetts. Um, that was the technology of that time. I was interested in how the romantic ideal of a bond with nature, of a spiritual perception of nature, was in conflict or competition with the attraction and the dominance of technology. Um, in Roethke, we see that playing out. That his father used technology in growing those flowers. His father created beauty. Um, the the technology offered a structure, a way to make it happen. And Roethke, in his greenhouse poems, did in verse what his father had done with his florist business. He Rather than technology, it was poetic form, poetic technique. His father was his model, his idol, his mentor. if you will, as a poet. His father didn't write poetry, but his father indirectly showed Roethke how to create beauty in a structure, in form.
The Center for the Study of Pacific Northwest writes, quote, the son of a flower grower, a nurseryman, he found the Northwest to be a kind of ancient greenhouse where nature felt less used up, more nearby than wherever he'd lived before. Does that ring true with you?
From Roethke's biography, The Glass House, it does. Um, Roethke was not an much of an outdoorsman, especially by the time he got to Seattle. Um, he was not a person to take long hikes. He didn't hike in the mountains. Uh, he- I think Seeger has a story about if Roethke went to the woods near Seattle, he wouldn't take a long walk. He would walk a little ways and find a grove and sit down and take it in. Um, yeah, I have to imagine um, being like him. I'm from the Saginaw Valley, and the Saginaw Valley is flat. It's an ancient glacial lake bed. Um, it's a, it's one of the flattest parts of Michigan, which is not. Michigan has a lot of hilly regions, but not the Saginaw Valley. And for him to move from the East Coast, where he'd been teaching, to the Pacific Northwest, to a mountainous region with the ocean nearby and the rainforest, um, it had to be striking. I'd be very interested to either read someone who has researched Roethke's papers to look at his letters to see what he told people because he didn't write about he wrote there's Pacific Northwest landscape in his poetry. It doesn't really appear in his the few essays that he wrote, but it must appear in his letters. I'd be very interested to see um, what he got down about his impressions.
Those letters would be at the Suzzallo Library?
Yes, and the
Yeah,
Roethke Papers is Zazula Library, University of Washington.
yeah. In your introduction to the field guide, you write, quote, for Roethke, all of nature is conscious and endowed with spirit or soul, particularly plants and animals, who figure in his poems as companions and spirit guides. He emphasizes this faith in his essay on identity. If the dead can come to our aid in a quest for identity, so can the living, and I mean all living things. This is not so much a naive as a primitive attitude, animist maybe, why not? Everything that lives is holy. I call upon these holy forms of life. Is this attitude something that would be more accepted on the West Coast and Cascadia than in a place like Saginaw, Michigan or Lansing, Michigan?
I don't think it's a matter of region. I think it's a matter of personality. You know, um, I've met people from every region of the United States, and I've met very utilitarian-minded people from every region, and I've met more mystically inclined people from every region. Um, Roethke came from Saginaw. Um, he was an exceptional person, but the region and its history produced him. Um, I think in retrospect, you can see that Roethke as a teacher and as a poet uh, was a pioneer in the Pacific Northwest. He had uh, students who did went on to do great work, and he inspired others. I know that Gary Snyder saw Roethke read. I seem to remember reading in Gary Snyder's essays about Roethke, um, coming down to California to read. Um, so I don't think uh, there's certainly a romantic tradition in the Midwest. That was something that I tracked in my book, The Midwestern Pastoral. I was very interested to see the conflict um, between that romantic impulse, the mystical impulse, the connection with nature, the romanticism with the utilitarian, um, which can be, um, it can see the utilitarian element in America often sees nature as simply for its instrumental value, that it's a resource, that it's something to be used and changed into something else to make money, to be dominated. But it doesn't have to be that. So, writers like Willa Cather, that's a basic conflict in much of her writing. You have characters like in O Pioneers or My Antonia who have that idea, like as Roethke was quoting from what you read, everything that lives is holy. That's a borrowing from William Blake. Willa Cather believed that, and she had characters who believed that, but they were in conflict with characters who um, believed had one motivation, which was money and position. But that's an American conflict. That's not just the Midwest.
Yeah.
Uh,
The bioregionalists say that the product of that extraction thinking is always garbage. I mean, even if you look at manufactured goods, we see the country landscapes or even some city landscapes with all kinds of used cars with blackberries going through them. So that was the bioregionalists' complaint or perception that the product of that extraction mentality literally was garbage. Very interesting. Also in the introduction, that there's this quote, Roethke's poetry as spiritual expression. And the phrase spiritual biography is used to describe his poetry. I'd love for you to elaborate on that and contrast that with people for whom poetry is not a spiritual biography.
well, the modernist part of the modernist impulse, especially that which was received through T.S. Eliot, who was an important influence on Roethke. He was an influence on everyone, but uh, it purported to negate the personal. It spoke of the uh, extinction of personality, that the writer, the poet, should um, seek to transcend the self. And that was in defiance of the romantic impulse, which was autobiographical. Wordsworth wrote autobiography in verse, and there was the exaltation of self in romanticism that um, probably could be said to have gotten to be excessive by the end of the 19th century. And there was a desire to do something different. Um, but scholars have shown that even a poet who supposedly was not writing about himself, like T.S. Eliot or his friend Ezra Pound, can be shown. It can be their work can be read to show that in fact they were. Um, in Roethke, we see a turn away from the modernist rejection of spiritual autobiography. Um, when Roethke had what was it at once an advantage and a disadvantage. He was coming as a young man. Um, he was in high school in the 1920s. He was in college in the late 20s, starting as a writer in the 30s. The modernists were very much alive. They were, in their middle age and were writing important work. And they were already literary giants. So, at that point, you have to wonder, well, what would a young writer do? How could a writer strike new ground and not just repeat? And Roethke was the one American poet who really hit on it. He wrote about himself um, in all his work, and it does form a spiritual autobiography. His work from the very beginning, from the first poem of his first book, Open House, the title poem, Open House, he is speaking about his spirit and his struggle with his spirit, and his place on earth. Um, um, so that became his part of his great contribution. I think that Roethke is the key poet of mid 20th century American verse. Um, the middle generation poets are um, are somewhat or very much younger than him. Sylvia Plath was an acolyte of Roethke. She started out something of an imitator and was told you need to kind of go your own way a little more. But his mark is clear on her work, as original and astonishing as her work is. Roethke lit a fire under Sylvia Plath that inspired her. And that generation of writers wrote about themselves. They wrote about their emotional struggles, their struggles with mental health,
Yeah,
uh,
struggles with their parents.
struggles with the parents. Freud was a great influence on Roethke and the others. Most of them had experienced psychotherapy. Um, Reki stands out though because he is the most romantic and ultimately the one who is the most um there's a darkness, there's a struggle in Reki. There's great pain in Reki, but there is great joy in his work. He writes of the experience of joy and of transcendence. There's a passage I believe I quoted somewhere about how despite the muck, the darkness in my work, um, um, he he's a poet of joy. Um, I just opened my essay in the book to a quote from Roethke where he says, I believe to go forward as a spiritual man, it is necessary first to go back. Any history of the psyche or allegorical journey is bound to be a succession of experiences, similar yet dissimilar. There is a perpetual slipping back, then a going forward, but there is some progress. He put progress in quotation marks, and that's much of his work. His great poems like The Lost Son, which is about a psychological crisis. It reflects his first manic episode, which he presented as a spiritual crisis. Um, but that famous poem, one of Roethke's greatest poems, his great breakthrough, ends with that sense of a moving forward despite having gone into the darkness. The Lost Son ends. If I can quickly find the ending here. Um, a lively, understandable spirit once entertained you. It will come back. It will come again. Be still. Wait. So the poem uses a great symbolic language of nature to convey a psychological breakdown. It returns to his childhood, to the greenhouses, and his father working with the plants, and then it comes to the present and a calm finally at the end with the idea that it's going to be okay. Hold on and it'll be okay.
You're talking about the personal experience and the turn away from that from the modernists. Michael McClure, in the book Scratching the Beat Surface, said the way to the universal is by means of the most intensely personal. And I think that's something that Roethke would resonate with. Um, there's one,
Michael McClure, by the way, wrote a poem inspired by Roethke.
yeah, dedicated to, wasn't it?
Yeah, dedicated to Roethke.
Before Michael was writing projective verse, he was writing formal verse and getting published as a young man in Poetry Magazine. I believe
Yeah.
that's where that appeared. Yeah. Um, in the introduction to the book, you also write the first section of the Far Field consists of North American sequence, six long meditations in free verse, in which Roethke both celebrates the physical world and tries to, quote, transcend this sensual emptiness. The continued power of this sequence, and in this time of global environmental crisis, its urgent relevance, commend the inclusion in this volume of essays on all six poems: The Longing, Meditation at Oyster River, Journey to the Interior, The Long Waters, The Far Field, and The Rose. If you were to argue in favor of Sam Hamill's notion that Cascadian poetry started with this sequence, what would you say?
Well, I'm not, I'm more of a specialist on literature and poetry of the Midwest than the Pacific Northwest. But from what I've read of writing from the Pacific Northwest, that strikes me as true. You know, given that Roethke was a professor, was a mentor personally to great poets of the Pacific Northwest. Um, and then those that he indirectly influenced through his books. The poets of the Pacific Northwest cite him, they refer to him. Um, Roethke, Roethke's a poet's poet, and that's true nationally and even internationally. He's a poet that poets talk about, that poets write about. Um, you know, he had a great influence on Irish poets, including Seamus Heaney, John Montague, and others. Um, so that's, I think, intensified in the Pacific Northwest because of his presence. He was formative. He was there teaching the writing of poetry when that was uh, kind of a new academic area to teach creative writing, to teach the writing of poetry, and that's what he did. He was a pioneer in that era, and he was in Seattle, and he was so his immediate base of students were Pacific Northwest writers. There's a book that's waiting for someone to write a study of Roethke and Pacific Northwest poetry. I've read a couple good essays, but there's a book to be written. It's a really wonderful topic yet to be fully developed.
Carolyn Kaiser, Richard Hugo,
Sure.
David Wagner, Tess Gallagher. Yeah, and that's a partial list just off the top of my head. One thing that feels very Cascadian to me, and in the tradition of spiritual but not religious, you write about, quote, Roethke's fundamentally romantic mysticism, his belief in the primacy of individual experience over religious doctrine. And of course, that animism that we talked about earlier, though I don't know if we use that word. Does that ring true to you that Roethke was spiritual but not religious? And that's really the ethos of the state of Washington, and one can argue most of Cascadia. That's not to say that there's no religion here, but when I first moved here from the Midwest, I grew up in Chicago, I saw that backpacking was considered by many the equivalent of a spiritual quest, like going to church on Sunday. I'm going to the Olympics. So, what do you say about Roethke's spiritual but not religious, maybe making him the first Cascadian with that kind of mentality.
Um, that may be true. I'm not aware of who might have preceded him. Of course, even, Roethke was aware of the Native American tradition in the Pacific Northwest that romantic poets have always hearkened to, and even if they weren't knowledgeable or accurate in their um, apprehension of Native American traditions, um, acknowledged acknowledged those traditions, um, of words, of song, of um, of singing the landscape as one walks, creating a map of the local landscape through song. Um, but that strikes me. Roethke was he was romantic. Um, he and in that way he followed Whitman, uh, who would say things that soon there'll be no need for churches. The when Roethke uses the word God, it's not personal God. You know, um, it's the God of Spinoza. It's it's the way that Whitman spoke of God. Um, that there's another study to be made on Roethke's spirituality. He might be uh, Roethke did use the word animist in that passage that you quoted. He might be thought of as a pantheist. You know that uh, that idea of God is simply a name for all of reality, for creation. The creator is the creation that it's so he might be thought of as pantheist. I've connected Roethke with Taoism more recently in the introduction to the field guide to the poetry of Theodore Roethke. Um, I I talk about Taoism, the tradition, the Chinese tradition of thinking of reality as flow. The key metaphor is the river, the continual flow, a cycle of creation and recreation. Um, it's ultimately consistent with physics, with what scientists tell us about what they understand about how the universe how the universe works. Um, the Tao is the great flow of existence. My argument was that if Retke is a Taoist, he's focused on the day, um, as in the Tao Te Ching. Um, the Tao is the great flow of existence. Day is the power inherent in small phenomena, small um, particles, small beings, um,
Like a mouse.
like a mouse. Retke has a poem called "The Small," so that tells you a lot about his perspective on things. And here was this big, this tall, heavy, hulking man who wrote this most delicate poetry, both formal poetry and free verse that was very delicate, and he often focused on small things. He loved the word pebble and the image of a pebble. Um, um, Minnow. He speaks of minnows, the smallest fish. Individual leaves. The poem "The Meadow Mouse." Um, he speaks of small, vulnerable creatures and parts of nature. So the day in Taoism is the power that is inherent in small things. small creatures, small consciousness. Uh, that I think is a way to understand Retke's spirituality. I connected to his feeling for landscape. Um, the Pacific Northwest has grand landscapes, landscapes that are sublime. You know, um, the mountain ranges, the valleys, the ocean coast. They're powerful, sublime um, landscapes. Roethke came from a very subtle landscape. Um, Michigan is a beautiful state, and it has the Great Lakes, it has the shores, it has, hills and cliffs. But Saginaw Valley, as I mentioned, is a flat glacial till. It's flat. Um, Reki wrote beautiful nature poetry about that region. It's understated beauty, where you look at the beauty underfoot. You look up close. For, so in Retke's Michigan poems, when I read those, I remember the overcast skies from the lake effect. The clouds produced by Lake Michigan. So there are days walking in the woods along the river, and all the humid smells and the the duff under the pine trees. That's in Roethke's work. In the Pacific Northwest, his work, it does open up, and I think that the long lines in the far field represent that opening up, that there are more vistas, there are more uh, panoramic views that necessitated the longer lines. Um,
Whitmanic lines.
yeah, Whitmanic lines, all also influenced by Eliot, though he makes a point of naming uh, referring to Eliot and rejecting Eliot's perspective on things. He's certainly influenced by um, his poetics. Um, but the beginning of the rose from the North American sequence, there are those to whom place is unimportant. He's referring to Eliot, who said that here and there do not matter in the four quartets. Here and there do not matter, and Roethke utterly rejected that. Um, that for him, spirituality is embodied. It's in the world. It's in nature. It's in place. There are those to whom place is unimportant, but this place where sea and freshwater meet is important, where the hawks sway out into the wind without a single wing beat, and the eagles sail low over the fir trees, and the gulls cry against the crows in the curved harbors, and the tide rises up against the grass nibbled by sheep and rabbits. A little further down, I sway outside myself into the darkening currents, into the small spillage of driftwood, the small, the water is swirling past the tiny headlands. Um, Very clearly a Pacific Northwest,
And I
you know.
understand the San Juan Islands.
Yes.
He spent some time on Orcas Island when his house, after he bought it, was being remodeled. And then in part two of that poem, and I think of roses, roses, white and red in the wide 600-foot greenhouses, and my father standing astride the cement benches, lifting me high over the 4-foot stems, the Mrs. Russells and his own elaborate hybrids, and how those flower heads seemed to flow toward me, to beckon me, only a child, out of myself. What need for heaven, then, with that man and those roses?
There it is, right? He, in the Pacific Northwest, looking at a wild rose, it 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 makes him remember the roses in his father's greenhouse and the transcendental experience that he recalls as a child, being drawn out of himself by by the flowers. What need for heaven then with that man and those roses? And that's a very serious statement. It's not just an offhand comment. That is his spirituality expressed right there. What need for heaven then? What need for religion? What need for a mythology of an otherworldly promised paradise when we have paradise, we're in paradise if we make it so.
And you love your old man.
And you love your old man.
Yeah. Bill,
Your fault.
what an experience this has been to pick your brain about this and give us some good leads. I'm really grateful for how you've chosen to spend your life's energy and what Roethke has meant to this part of the world and what can be possible because of the start that he made here. So I'm grateful to Theodore Roethke. I'm grateful to you, and I hope our paths cross again soon.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure. Bill Barillas is editor of A Field Guide to the Poetry of Theodore Roethke and serves on the board of the Friends of the Roethke Foundation.